You check the lock on your door before you sleep. You glance behind you in an empty parking lot. You feel a prickle on your neck when a room goes quiet. You have never met a predator in your life. So why does your body still act like one is coming? The answer is far stranger than you think. For millions of years, your ancestors were not the most dangerous thing in the room. They were the meal. Long before humans held spears, before they controlled fire, before they had language to warn each other, they were hunted. Not occasionally, not as a rare accident of bad luck. Regularly, systematically, by an animal built specifically to take them apart. You already know the story you were taught. Early humans as fearless hunters, striding across the savannah, spears in hand, kings of the food chain from the very beginning. That story is comforting. It is also mostly fiction. It is the kind of story that gets told backward. We look at where humans ended up, at the top of every food chain on every continent, and assume that must have been the plan all along. But evolution does not work like a plan. It works like a series of narrow escapes. And your ancestors had more narrow escapes than almost any other creature that has ever lived. The real story starts with a cave in South Africa and a single small skull. In 1924, a fossil was discovered in Taung, South Africa. It belonged to a young Australopithecus africanus, an early human ancestor, just a few years old at the time of death. For decades, scientists assumed the child had died from a fall or an accident. Then, in 1970, an anatomist named C.K. Brain examined the skull more closely. He found punctures in the eye sockets, talon marks, marks that matched almost perfectly the feeding pattern of a large bird of prey. Not a lion, not a leopard. An eagle, likely something close to a modern crowned eagle, had killed this child and carried the skull away like a piece of meat. Think about that for a second. Your ancestors were small enough and vulnerable enough that a bird could hunt them. And it was not just birds. Fossil evidence across Africa tells a wider, darker story. Bones of early hominins have been found with puncture wounds that match the canine spacing of big cats. Some skulls show clean bite marks consistent with leopards, who are known even today to drag prey into trees to keep it away from scavengers. Other remains bear the telltale gnaw patterns of hyenas, patient and opportunistic, perfectly happy to pick apart something too small and too slow to fight back. There was one predator, though, that stands out above the rest. Its name was Dinophalis. Dinophalis was a saber-toothed cat, roughly the size of a modern jaguar, but built with proportions that suggest something even more specialized. Some researchers, including anthropologist C.K. Brain again, have proposed that Dinophalis may have been a hominin specialist. Not a general predator that happened to eat early humans when it got the chance. A predator that may have specifically targeted them, the way modern leopards in certain regions today develop a taste for a particular kind of prey. Does that sound impossible? It shouldn't. Modern predators do this constantly. Certain tigers in one region develop a preference for livestock. Certain sharks in one bay develop a pattern of testing swimmers, then leaving them alone. Predators are not random. They specialize when specializing pays off. And for a stretch of prehistory, a slow, upright, defenseless primate wandering open grassland in small clusters may have been exactly the kind of easy, repeatable meal a predator like Dinophalis would learn to specialize in. Early hominins were, by predator standards, almost perfect prey. They were slow compared to a sprinting cat. They lacked claws, fangs, or thick hide. They were bipedal, which made them highly visible moving upright across open grassland, but also meant their hands were free, which mattered later, but not yet. At this stage in the story, upright walking mostly just made them easier to spot. They were, in the coldest biological sense, a walking meal with almost no defenses. This is the part of human history that rarely makes it into documentaries. For a huge stretch of time, arguably longer than the entire span of recorded civilization combined, your ancestors were not apex predators. They were somewhere in the middle of the food chain, sometimes prey, occasionally scavengers. Rarely, if ever, the ones doing the hunting. Picture it honestly. No fire yet to keep the dark at bay. No spears with stone points, only sticks, if that. No language sophisticated enough to shout a precise warning about which direction the danger was coming from. Just small groups of soft-bodied primates huddled together at night, trying to survive until sunrise using nothing but numbers and nerves. How many generations does it take to shape an instinct that deeply? More than you might think, and also, in evolutionary terms, barely any time at all. A trait that keeps you alive long enough to reproduce spreads fast. A trait that gets you killed disappears just as fast. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the hominins who survived were not the boldest ones. They were the ones who flinched first. Anthropologist Robert Sussman spent decades studying this exact question, and in his research, later summarized in the book Man the Hunted, co-written with Donna Hart, he laid out the case plainly. Early humans were, for most of their evolutionary history, prey animals first. The image of the fearless hunter came much, much later, and even then it developed slowly, painfully, generation after generation of trial and error. So how did your ancestors survive an animal, or a whole caste of animals, built to kill them? Not with strength, not with speed, not with teeth or claws. With groups, with vigilance, with fear. Fear, it turns out, may be one of the most successful survival tools your ancestors ever developed. A hominin alone in tall grass was almost certainly dead. A hominin in a group, constantly scanning the tree line, constantly listening for a change in the wind or a shift in bird calls, had a chance. Hypervigilance was not a flaw. It was the entire strategy. This is where the story stops being ancient history and starts being personal. That prickle on the back of your neck in an empty room? That is not random. That is the same threat detection system that kept a small, slow, clawless ancestor of yours alive long enough to have children. The instinct to check dark corners, to feel uneasy when something is off in your environment, to startle at sudden movement in your peripheral vision, none of that was designed for modern life. It was designed for Dinophilis. It was designed for eagles with talons the size of your palm. It was designed for a world where being the slowest one in the group meant being the one that got taken. Your brain has not caught up to the fact that the danger is mostly gone. Consider how strange this is. You can walk down a city street today with almost no chance of being killed by a large predator. And yet, studies in evolutionary psychology consistently show that humans are far more prepared, neurologically, to fear snakes, spiders, and sudden looming shapes than they are to fear something statistically far more dangerous, like a car. Researcher Arne Oman's work on what is often called prepared learning found that humans acquire a fear of ancient threats, like snakes, almost instantly and with very little exposure, while modern dangers require repeated negative experiences before the brain treats them as threatening. Why would your brain be wired that way, unless it was shaped by something that hunted people who couldn't feel that fear fast enough? Think about the last time you watched a nature documentary and felt your stomach tighten during a chase scene, even knowing the prey animal would probably survive because the cameras were still rolling. That reaction is not something you chose. It is something older than choice. Your nervous system does not distinguish well between a gazelle on a screen and your own ancestors in tall grass. Both trigger the same ancient alarm. The predators are gone now. Dinophilis went extinct roughly 1 million years ago. The eagles that hunted hominin children in South Africa are still around, but they no longer see you as prey. The leopards and hyenas of that era are long gone, replaced by descendants who mostly avoid humans entirely. In almost every measurable way, you are safer than any of your ancestors ever were. But the wiring is still there. That is why horror movies work on you, even the bad ones. That is why a sudden noise in a dark house makes your heart rate spike before your conscious brain even finishes processing what happened. That is why open, exposed spaces at night still feel unsettling, even in a neighborhood with a low crime rate and working streetlights. You are not being irrational. You are running software that is roughly 2 million years old in a body living in a world that changed faster than that software could update. There is something almost humbling in that. The confident, tool-making, city-building, technology-inventing version of your species is a very recent development. For most of the story, you were not the one in control. You were the one hiding, the one listening, The one who survived not because you were strong, but because you were careful and because you stayed close to the group. It also explains something else about you. Why loneliness feels, even now, like a kind of danger, not just an emotional discomfort. Why being excluded from a group can trigger a response in the brain that overlaps with physical pain. Isolation was not just sad for an early hominin, it was often fatal. A single body alone on the grassland was an easy target. A body inside a group had a chance. That math is still running somewhere underneath every uncomfortable feeling you get when you feel left out. Maybe that is the real reason horror stories almost always follow the same pattern. Someone wanders off alone. Someone ignores a warning sign. Someone gets separated from the group in the dark. It is not just a storytelling trick. It is a memory, buried so deep you don't even recognize it as memory anymore, of a time when wandering off alone in the dark was, quite literally, how a member of your species ended up in the stomach of something with teeth built specifically to open a skull. You lock the door. You glance over your shoulder. You feel that prickle on your neck in a quiet room. Not because you are afraid of nothing, because somewhere, buried under everything you have built since, is the memory of an animal that almost erased your entire family tree before it even had a chance to begin. The more we learn about the past, the better we understand ourselves. If this video sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow Phoenix Primeval for more fascinating stories from history, science, and human evolution. Thanks for watching.